You're watching Roundtable. Welcome to the program. China's president has called Vladimir Putin his best friend, and together they've said that the relationship between their countries has no limits. But after Russia's attack on Ukraine, China's been under pressure. Washington warning Beijing of what it called consequences should it provide military or financial assistance to Moscow. Will China reconsider its relationship with Russia? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The closeness of China and Russia is a worry to the United States and others in the West. And yet China's reach is truly global. And it's made it clear that it doesn't want to face economic penalties as a result of supporting Russia in this conflict with Ukraine. So how can China remain close to Russia and the West at the same time? This difficult time for the security of the world. Okay, time to bring in, first of all, Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for China and Globalization. He's in Beijing. In Suffolk, in the United Kingdom, Natasha Kuhrt, Lecturer in International Peace and Security in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. And then to North Carolina, on the east coast of the United States, Professor Klaus Larres, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Good to have you all with us. Andy, I'm going to come to you first of all. There seems to be a bit of confusion about what China's position actually is. What is it trying to do here?
Well, I think this is the Western media narrative, David, that what is China trying to do? It's very clear. I think China's been unequivocal and impartial in saying that it really wants to see a peaceful resolution to the Ukrainian situation as quickly as possible. It does not stand with the U.S. and a handful of Western countries in sanctioning Russia, weaponizing trade, weaponizing the international payment system, really, I think, unleashing a torrent of forces that will backfire against the West, and saying that each side's views and legitimate concerns need to be respected, that conflict should be resolved peacefully, and yet not picking a side. And I think that's been clear as day and has been distorted, unfortunately, by a number of Western media.
But would it be fair to say that China's taking this position because at the moment it's not entirely sure who's going to be the winner in all of this, and it doesn't want to back the wrong horse?
Well, David, as we all know, the world is a complex, messy place. And whether we're talking about individuals, companies, or countries, there always is a balance between principle and self-interest. So I think to try to portray China, as some in the Western media has, as being opportunistic, again, I think is severely misguided. I think China certainly, like any country, of course, is going to look out for its own interest, but also I think has played a crucial role in maintaining the global order, even though China, of course, has expressed some dissatisfaction with the order. But look at the 2008 financial crisis. Look at the COVID pandemic and the role that China has played in stabilizing and in some sense even rescuing the world from these crises. So I think that, we really can't say that China is against the global order. Certainly unhappy with certain elements of it, and especially how it's becoming increasingly weaponized to the detriment of all.
Okay, let's talk about weapons. Natasha, let me come to you. Two allegations. One, that China knew in advance that this was going to happen, but was perhaps surprised by the scale of it. And secondly, that Russia has asked for military aid from China, weapons and advisors. What do you think of those 2 points?
Well, regarding the weapons, there is controversy about that point, because I think there is also evidence to show that there were pre-existing deals So it's not clear at all whether these are weapons that have been asked for now or whether they are contracts or agreements that had already been made.
And what about the suggestion that China knew of what Russia was planning to do in Ukraine in advance?
Yeah, again, obviously difficult to verify, but I think that it's most likely that Putin perhaps talked about a special military operation to Xi when they met at the Olympics. But I think it would be very surprising had Putin shown Xi his full hand, if you like, and if he had actually told him the full scale of the operation that was going to be undertaken.
So he knew something of what was going on.
Because I don't think that, well, of course, I don't know for sure, but, you know, I think the weight of evidence, if you like, points to perhaps some indication that something was going to be undertaken in Ukraine.
Okay.
But, you know, as we all know, many of us were expecting the eastern areas to be taken, and that's it.
Andy, come back to you in a moment, but I want to bring Klaus in. Klaus, this is after I read out some details of trade and the relationship between the two countries. This is after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Russia and China have signed a 30-year deal worth $400 billion for Gazprom to deliver Russian gas to China. Total trade between China and Russia jumped 35.9% last year to a record $146.9 billion. And the two were aiming to boost total trade to $200 billion by 2024. What is the position here if Russia is entirely isolated from a Chinese point of view? What does it stand to lose?
Well, Russia has become a clear liability for China. There used to be close relations between China and Russia. Now I think the Chinese are wondering whether Putin is the right horse to have settled on. Then, of course, China has also very close economic relations with Ukraine. Ukraine is an important country in the Belt and Road initiative, and that also needs to be taken into consideration. If I can just make 2 points in reply to my Chinese colleague here. I mean, if you have political difficulties and if you are not happy with the current situation, as Putin clearly was, you do not just invade another country. You know, this is no way to settle differences. You know, invading a country should be condemned by anyone under the sun. Secondly, the Chinese are clearly sitting on the fence. They have it in their power because of Xi's personal relationship with Putin, of China's economic relations with Putin. They could put an awful lot of pressure on Putin to stop the war kind of immediately. And to just say everyone is interested in a peaceful resolution, yes, of course we are, but the Chinese have it actually in their power to do something about it. And they are not. They are sitting on the fence. This is very deplorable. And it really comes to the situation that together with Russia, China is turning into an international pariah, which is very sad. And the Chinese should not want that. They should do something about it by using their influence and power on Putin to bring about an armistice, a ceasefire, by very concrete, practical means. And the Chinese, unlike many other countries, can actually do that.
Okay.
But they are
Klaus,
not doing
Klaus, I'm going to give Andy a chance to come back on that. The point is, why no condemnation when it was clearly in breach of international law? When people are dying, civilians are dying, young children are dying, why not condemn it?
Sure. Well, I think that Klaus, as a professor in this field, surely knows that for better or worse, and mostly for worse, the international system is an anarchic one that depends on self-help. Or to put this another way, as Bismarck said, the great questions can only be settled by blood and iron, meaning that, of course, every country's sovereignty needs to be respected, but they can also take actions that forfeit that sovereignty.
Yeah, okay, please, just the question, Andy. Why not condemn it when it is brutal and it's directed in part against civilians and in part against children? Why not condemn?
Well, I think who is worthy of condemnation here? The US and other NATO countries are supplying arms to Ukraine and, in a sense, exacerbating this conflict. I think one could look at this and say that who deserves the condemnation is the West. I'm not saying that this is what I think, but there's two sides to this question. And clearly, the Western media discourse is only focused on one side. So I think that, again, China's taking an impartial view, certainly deploring the violence, but not taking a side against Russia.
Okay. Natasha, I'm going to come to you. No, I'm going to, we don't go back and forward at the moment on that particular point, but Natasha, I want to come to you in just a second after we hear from the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
We encourage all parties to pay attention to the negative impact of NATO's continuous eastward expansion on Russia's security environment and seek to build a balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism in accordance with the principles of indivisibility of security.
So after what you hear from Andy, China sitting on the fence, he says, let's condemn the West. Surely one of the reasons why China has done very little in terms of distancing itself from what Russia has done is because it is worried about the effect this might have on its plans for Taiwan.
Yeah, I think we need to be a little bit careful about Taiwan, because I think Taiwan does have its own particular dynamics. But what I think is interesting is that I believe that for China, the Ukraine conflict can be seen as a kind of proxy for how would the West react if China were to take Taiwan, for example? And China has been very taken aback by the unity of the West, which I think until the Ukraine war had not been very unified, by the unity of the West and by the strength and power of the sanctions that have been imposed. And so that's quite a sobering thought for China, were it to have in mind taking back Taiwan.
So, Natasha, China perhaps surprised at the unity of the West, and this is from China's Foreign Minister, Wang Li. China isn't party to the crisis, nor does it want sanctions to affect China. China has a right to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. It is worried about the same sanctions landing on its doorstep, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why I said I think it's a kind of proxy for any Chinese intervention in Taiwan. So were China to intervene in Taiwan, it might face the same level of sanctions. And I think after 2014, there were sanctions on Russia, but of course they were far weaker than the regime that we're seeing imposed now.
I'm going to come back to you, Andy, in just a moment. I know you want to reply, but I'm going to go to Klaus and say, look, the Brookings Institute, I've got this piece of paper in front of me, says China has a lot more to lose than Russia. China sees itself as a country on the rise with momentum behind it. Russia is essentially fighting the tides of decline. So do you think, therefore, that China can benefit, perhaps, from Russia's demise in this? Or does it need Russia as the bulwark with China against what it sees as Western imperialism? Otherwise, China would be on its own.
I would agree with the Brookings report on the whole. She, I believe, was not convinced that Putin would go into the whole of Ukraine. Perhaps he expected an invasion of eastern Ukraine, but not a full invasion as we have seen. He certainly did not expect that the Russian forces were met with such fierce resistance and are really losing the war and are not making much progress at all, and that it would lead to that carnage and destruction which we see in Ukraine. So Putin and the war have turned into a liability for China. And I think that old relationship which we saw on the 4th of February, where Putin and Xi signed a friendship treaty and spoke of a relationship without limits or no limits, that has really gone out of the window. And I think China is in danger of missing the bus. China has the unique opportunity to show that it is a responsible superpower, as it claims to be, and should really mediate in the conflict. And it is not doing that by sitting on the fence and half-heartedly supporting Putin, while also saying that the territorial integrity of Ukraine should be observed. That is, of course, a contradiction. And the Chinese have not...
We got your point at the moment, Klaus. Thank you. I'm going to throw that to Andy because I know there's quite a few things that you want to say. I don't know where you pick up. You choose.
Sure. Well, I would question the idea that Russia is isolated, first of all. So look at India, who has said that they're looking to set up a rupee-ruble agreement with Russia for oil and other goods. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, has declined to join the U.S. bandwagon. Thailand also has taken a more neutral position, other countries as well. So I'm not so sure, again, that this Western media narrative of Russia being isolated with China, the only country that is not against Russia, is true. The second claim, which is even more important to challenge, is this idea of Western unity. So we should not pay attention to what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine. But I think the real battle being fought is what happens if food prices, energy prices double and triple. I think that this will put tremendous pressure on the unity between the US and Europe. And in particular, I think Germany is very interesting here. So I have friends that are energy investors in the US that make the argument that Germany actually has a much greater affinity for Russia than it does the US, but because it's taboo to question this idea of Atlanticism, that this is all percolating under the surface. And these pressures, if they continue, of rising energy prices, rising food prices, refugees from Ukraine, is really going to fracture the unity between the U.S. and Europe. And again, to me, it's way too early to say how things are going to turn out.
Okay, but what do you accept that China has a great deal more to lose, Andy, than Russia? The Brookings report that China has to be extremely careful here.
Oh, absolutely. I don't disagree at all. China's policy for decades has been opening up and integration. So what's good for the world is good for China, but vice versa. What's good for China is also good for the world. And as we've seen in COVID, where there was a lot of expectation that this would hurt China's exports and imports, its overall trade. In fact, it turned out to be the exact opposite. So I think from China's national interests, yes, it has a lot at stake here, but also as a pillar of the global order, it has a lot at stake too. And I think China's been very clear and impartial. And I would question Klaus's claim about being a responsible superpower here. What he means is code for doing what the U.S. wants. And again, I think what we're seeing is really the emergence of a truly multipolar system, and that China is really taking a more objective view of this. It is tragic that people are being killed in the Ukraine, but is it any more tragic than women and children being maimed and killed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, other parts of the world where the U.S. has bombed, otherwise killed innocent civilians?
Sure. Okay, I'm just gonna go to Natasha on that one, because can you compare, Klaus, a minute, please, if you don't mind. Yeah. Natasha, can you compare conflicts and supposed, if you like, hypocrisy?
Well, this whataboutism is very prevalent, I've noticed. And of course, we can condemn, on the one hand, perhaps the kind of the intervention in Iraq and the dubious legality around that intervention, but that doesn't make this particular intervention right. So I don't think there's anything to be gained from that kind of discourse. I think you have to take each case on its own merits. And this is clearly a war of aggression.
Can I ask you this one, Natasha? Your speciality is war studies. Do you think Russia and indeed China, because China is the main topic of this conversation, were both surprised at the level of sophistication of armory, weaponry that was reaching the forces in Ukraine?
I think so. I mean, I can speak more for the Russian side than for the Chinese side. Maybe Andy could talk more to the Chinese reaction. But certainly, I think one thing that's interesting is that Russia really hasn't got to know Ukraine. You know, in the aftermath of 2014, it's paid very little attention to what's actually going on inside Ukraine, in society, but also in terms of the armed forces and the kind of, modernization of their military and so on and so forth.
Klaus, can I come to you and ask you about...
They're actually quite ignorant.
Okay, Natasha, thanks. Sorry. Let me come to you, Klaus, and the question is, the longer this goes on, is that better or worse, increasingly worse for China in its relationship, not just with Russia, but with the wider world, because it tries to be able to deal with both?
Yeah, it clearly would be a very bad idea if that went on for much longer. Of course, it would be very bad for the Ukrainians and the Western world, but also for China in particular. They can only lose, as I tried to explain before. China is sitting on the fence and doesn't quite know what to do. It doesn't want to drop Russia, but it doesn't really want to totally condemn the invasion either. So it has to do something, and it cannot decide. And that also doesn't reflect very positively on Xi. Xi, after all, is standing for re-election, so-called re-election in October, and his international leadership role now cannot be seen anywhere. I don't think that his Politburo colleagues will be impressed by the current Chinese leadership. So, the sooner the war is finished, I think everyone would benefit from that, including China. Can I just raise the issue of Western unity? Under normal circumstances, I think Mr. Mock has a point. Then, of course, for economic reasons, there often is or are divisions in the Western camp. But because of the carnage in Ukraine, because it was a war and is a war of aggression, and civilian targets are hit deliberately, and people are so outraged all over the world, that has brought the West together. I would say Putin has brought the West together, and the economy will not divide the West as long as the war under these circumstances continues. It really is a terrible carnage which is happening there.
Klaus, thank you very much indeed. Andy, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you this. Is it possible that this could, strangely enough, bring the United States and China closer together? Because the United States may end up asking China to help to end this conflict. If it does so, President Xi looks a little bit more statesmanlike. That deflects some of the criticism that might come at home and from the international community, that it could actually bring China and the United States closer together rather than forging a closer relationship in the long term between China and Russia?
No, I certainly see that possibility, David. So I was on a panel with Susan Thornton, the former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. And I think that we agreed on this point that if the U.S. Can drop some of its intransigence and its dogmatism to work with China, and also to show some flexibility with Russia as well, certainly this could be a catalyst for improved relations between the U.S. and China. Again, we have to recognize here the U.S. is playing a pivotal role in exacerbating this conflict. If the Ukrainians were not being armed with javelins, anti-tank missiles, etc., this conflict would be over very, very quickly.
Well, Andy, equally, you could say if they didn't have these anti-tank missiles, if they didn't have the weaponry, more and more of them would be dead, and their country would be overrun. Yes,
but they would not be brutally killed, as so many are complaining about, right? I mean, rightly so. But my point is that the U.S. seems ready to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. And it's unfortunate if the Ukrainians are naive enough or the leadership is cynical enough to play their part in this.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it there. Naive, cynical, bombs dropping on their heads. Make your own conclusions. Thank you very much indeed, Andy, Natasha, and Klaus. Thank you for watching this wherever you happen to be. I'm David Foster. We hope to have you with us for the next edition of Roundtable. We are giving you special reports on the background to the conflict in Ukraine. You can get the headlines anywhere. We'll give you the context here. Goodbye for now.